subscribe and click the bell icon to turn on notifications.
We've made the files the instructor uses in this tutorial available for free. Just click the link below in the video details to get these.
We're going to start out by talking about what exactly are logical functions. Well, if you're looking for them in Excel, and just a note as well, I'm using Excel 2021, which is the latest standalone version of Excel. Now, this version should be pretty much exactly the same as Excel for Office 365, and not that dissimilar from 2019 and 2016. But if my interface looks slightly different to you, that is why. It is the latest version. It's not going to have any effect on the functionality. Right, so logical functions. If we jump up to the Formulas tab, we can find them in the Functions library underneath this logical group. There are all our logical functions. And we're going to cover quite a few of these in the session today. So what exactly is a logical function at its core? Well, I'm just going to type a couple of random numbers into my spreadsheet. Now, what I could do here is I could perform a logical test. So if I type in equals, what I could say here, or I could ask a question effectively. I could say, is this number greater than this number? Now, notice in there, I'm using a greater than symbol. And that is what we call a logical operator. And you'll notice I've just got a little screenshot over on the side of some of the other common logical operators that you'll use in your calculations. So you've got equal to, greater than, less than, so on and so forth. Okay, so those logical operators are really going to help you when you're putting together your logical calculations. So we're asking a question here, is D13 greater than D14? What am I going to get if I hit enter? Well, I'm going to get the result of true because 10 is greater than 5. Okay. What about if I edit this formula? Let's double click and let's switch the operator around. So if I put it the other way, so I'm basically saying, is D13 less than D14? I'm getting the answer of false because that test, that logical test we've just done, is not true. Okay. So when you perform a logical test, you're only ever going to get an answer of true or false in the cell. So let's take a look at what that looks like in a more practical example. If we go to this little expenses table that we have up here, I just have a list of names and some expenses for those people. And what we're going to say here is that if the expense is greater than $1,000, then it needs to be approved by a manager. So what I could do here is perform a logical test in a very similar way. I could say equals, and we're asking, is this value, and I'm going to say greater than or equal to this value. Okay, now I'm going to copy this formula down. So what do I need to do to this cell? I need to lock it, press the F4 key. Because if I copy down without locking, this cell reference is also going to start to move down. Now, another little tip here, we're going to copy this formula down. If I was just to press the Enter key, it's going to take me to the cell below. But a lot of the time, if you're working in a cell, you want to remain in the same cell. Control Enter will leave your cursor in the same cell, and then you can double click to copy that formula down. Now notice what we have here, true and false results. So wherever I have a true result, I would expect the expense to be $1,000 or greater. Okay, that is how this works. Now that's all well and good, having these true and falses in here, but we don't really have too much meaning attached to them. Maybe instead of true and false, I want it to say something like approval or okay. Well, that is where we need to add in an if function. So we're going to do this again, but we're going to add meaning to this true and false output. So let's delete out all our hard work. Let's go back to the first cell, type in equals. We're going to go for equals if. Now notice when you type in a function in Excel, if it exists, hopefully it does, hopefully you know your functions, you're going to get a list pop up underneath. And this is what we call Excel's IntelliSense. And this list basically allows you to select whichever function it is that you're looking for. So if you have the one highlighted that you want to use, like I do here, all you need to do is press the Tab key to select it from the list, and it's going to put that first bracket in automatically for you. So just a little shortcut tip there. Now let's take a look at our arguments for our if function. Well, our first argument is the logical test, which is basically what we've just done. So this is really straightforward. Our logical test is this number greater than or equal to this number? Remember, F4 to lock that cell. That's our logical test. If I press comma, we can now assign meaning to the true and false values. So instead of an output of true, if it is true, I want it to say approval. And remember, text always has to go in those quote marks. If it's false, I just want it to say okay. All right, and close the bracket. That is our first if statement. How easy is that when you break it down? Control Enter to stay in that same cell. Now, another way that you can copy formulas down, instead of double clicking to copy it down, you could highlight all of your cells, Control D to copy that formula down. Okay, another useful little keyboard shortcut. So now, because we've assigned meaning, this is a lot easier to understand. And that's basically all an if does. It assigns meaning to the true and false output of a logical test. Okay, so that is our basic if. Hopefully, everyone's got their head around that. Just a note also, I'm on my own on the webinar today, so I can't monitor the chat panel. I can hear a little ping coming in, which means people are asking questions. So unfortunately, I can't switch to see your questions in the middle of the webinar. So write your question down. I'll leave a few minutes at the end to go through them with you. All right, let's jump across to some more complex examples. So this first little table at the top, we're going to do another example of if, and then we're going to add some complexity to it. So this time I have a little table that has some product names. I have the weight in kilograms of those products, and I have the price for each of those products. Oh, sorry, that's if example 2. I was thinking, have we got there already? There's another one at the top before that. Sorry, I forgot to scroll up. Let's start from the beginning. So I have a list of names in here, and these might be student names, and I have their scores that they've achieved in a test. And then we can see over here, the pass mark for this test is 85. So I want to use an if statement to test if this score that they've achieved is greater than or equal to the pass mark. If it is, I want a result of pass. If it's not, I want a result of fail. So let's practice our if. Equals if. Remember, press Tab key to select. Our logical test is this number greater than or equal to this number over here. Remember, if you're copying down, need to lock that cell. Well, if that is true, then yes, they've passed. Lucky them. Oops, let's put a capital there. If it's not, then unfortunately, they have failed. Use the bracket, Control Enter to stay in that same cell, copy down or select the cells and press Control D. Okay, again, another very straightforward if statement. All right, nice and simple. Let's add a bit of complexity into this if and get our if to perform a calculation. So again, we have similar data. We have our products listed in column A. We have the weight of those products, and then we have the price. And what we want to do here is we want to work out the shipping fee for these products. And what we're saying here is that if the weight is greater than or equal to 30, then the shipping fee is going to be 20% of the price of the item. So a little bit more complexity here. How do we do it? Well, equals if, Tab key to select, what is our logical test? This is the easy part. So our logical test is if the weight is greater than or equal 30, and again, we need to lock that value in place, comma. What do we want it to do if that is true? Well, if that is true, I want Excel to work out 20% of the price because that's going to be the shipping fee. So we can add a calculation here instead of just text. So I'm going to say if it's true, I want you to do C14 multiplied by 20%. And again, I need to press F4 to lock that in. If it's false, well, then there is no shipping fee. So I'm just going to put 2 quote marks in there, which is basically just leave the cell blank. Close the bracket, Control, Enter. The first one is blank, but if I copy this down, I should find that the only 2 where I have shipping fees are where the weight is 30 kilograms or more. And I can see that yes, that is correct. And where that is true, this value here is 20% of the price. Okay, so if you just look at that formula in the formula bar, we've just added a calculation for the true argument. All right, so ifs can get quite complex and become really useful. So now that we've got our head around that, we kind of know what we're doing here with if. Let's move down and introduce a couple more logical functions. And we're going to start out with the AND logical function. Now, what this does is it basically says you can basically perform 2 logical tests. So if we take a look at our data, I've got my student names. And again, let's say that they've just taken some tests. We've got the score that they've achieved in test 1 and the score that they've achieved in test 2. And then over here, we have the pass marks for test 1 and test 2. Now, what I want to say here is if they've scored above the pass mark in the first test and the second test, they get a result of pass. If they haven't, they're going to get a result of fail. So even if they've passed one test but not the other, the result's going to be fail because both logical tests have to be true to receive a pass. Okay, so let's take a look at this using the AND function. Again, I'm going to press the Tab key to select. Our first argument is logical test number 1. So again, this is pretty straightforward. We want to say, is this value greater than or equal to this value? F4 to lock that cell, comma. We can now provide logical test number 2. So is this value greater than or equal to this value? F4 to lock those cells. And we close off our bracket. So both of these have to be true, okay? So if I hit Enter or Control Enter and then copy this down, those are my results. Now notice I'm getting true or false because in order to assign meaning, what do we need to do? We need to use if. So what I could do here, instead of true or false, I want to see pass or fail. So if we go back and edit our first formula where we have our AND, that's perfectly fine. That is our logical test. But if I want to add meaning, I can just wrap it in an if statement. So I'm going to type in if, open bracket. Logical test is our first argument. Well, the logical test is what we have or what the AND formula is generating. So this is our logical test. So all we need to do is click at the end and then provide what we want it to say if it's true and what we want it to say if it's false. So if both of these are true, they get a pass. If one or both of them are false, they get a fail. Okay, and close the bracket, Control Enter, and then we can copy that down. All right. So again, we've added a little bit of complexity. Have a little review in the formula bar up here. We started with our logical function to get our true or false, and then we wrapped it in an if to give it more meaning. And sometimes I find, particularly when I was learning how to do this, sometimes instead of starting out typing the if into a cell, I always like to start out doing the and, reviewing it, and then wrapping it in an if. I just find that a bit easier to understand when I was learning. So let's do the opposite of that, because aside from and, we also have a function called or. Now this basically says only one of these has to be correct, not both of them, to get a result of pass. So score 1 or score 2 has to be higher than the pass mark. And we do this in exactly the same way. So I'm going to start out with or again. Let's press tab. Logical 1 is this greater than or equal to this? F4 to lock that in place. Or is this greater than or equal to this? F4. Let's close the bracket. Control Enter. Let's just check that we're on the right track. I'm going to double click to copy that down. Pretty much everything here is true except the last one. I don't like those true or falses. Let's add some meaning. What do? We clickety click and we add if in there. Okay, if there is our logical test being generated by the or, we add pass on the end and fail. Control Enter and then copy down. I'm going to do Control D. Okay. So quite a bit to take in there. We've seen another example of if. We've seen how we can combine it with a calculation. And we've seen how we can use if along with and or logical functions. Okay? All right. Let's start to ramp things up a little bit in terms of how we're using our ifs. We're going to move on to taking a look at nested if statements. Now, what does that exactly mean? Well, it's not as complicated as it sounds. It just means that we're putting if statements inside other if statements. Now, why on earth would we want to do that? Well, let's take a look at a good example. Now, I have a bit of a larger data set here, and in column A, I have some employee names. I can see what building they're located in, their department, hire date, the number of years that they've worked at the company, their salary, but the most important column here is their job rating column, because this is what I'm basing my entire if off of. Now, notice off to the side, I have a little table just here. And this is showing me job ratings and the amount of bonus that's attributed to each of those job ratings. So depending on the job rating of the employee, that determines what their bonus for the year is going to be. So what I want to do here is I basically want to perform a logical test which says if the job rating is equal to 5, then they're going to get a bonus of 3,000. But if the job rating is equal to 4, they're going to get 1,500. If it's equal to 3, 900, so on and so forth. So we have multiple if statements going on here. And I will say, when you start to do nested ifs, you do feel a bit like a formulas guru at the end, because you end up with an extremely long formula, which looks very complicated to the uninitiated eye. It's not, but the formulas are extremely long. So let's take a look at how we can construct this very slowly. So we're going to type in equals. We're going to go for if. What is our first logical test here? Well, if the job rating is equal to 5, and we're going to copy this down. So what do we need to do? Block. So if that is true, I want them to have 3,000. I want an output of 3,000 in the cell. F4 to lock. Now what I do here, instead of providing a false value, I need to go straight into my next if. Okay, and this is why they're called nested, because it's like ifs inside of ifs. So we're going to go into the next if. What is our next logical test? Well, if the job rating is equal to 4, and we want to lock that, then they're going to get 1,500. Into our next if. if the job rating is equal to 3, then they're going to get 900, comma, and we carry on going. If the job rating is equal to 2, then they're going to get 100. And then finally, if the job rating is equal to 1, then they're not going to get anything, unfortunately. Okay, and then value if false right at the end. So value if false, I'm just going to put a 0 on the end there. Take a look at how long that is. But that is nested ifs in a nutshell. It's just ifs inside other ifs. Now, the important thing to remember here is that when you're closing off your formula, you want to make sure you close off as many brackets as you've opened, brackets or parentheses if you're in the US. Now, I think I have 5. Let's go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the end. The good thing with Excel is that if you don't put enough brackets on the end, it will prompt you to add more, and it will add them automatically for you. Control, Enter. Now, I would expect to have that with a job rating of 1. So let's double click to copy down and take a look. And there we go. I now have all of my outputs in there. All right. But take a look at that long formula. As I said, you do feel like a bit like an Excel guru once you've finished, because it does look very impressive. So that is nested ifs in a nutshell. Now, I could make this a lot simpler. Maybe I just wanted to have bonus or no bonus in this column. So maybe I want my if statement to look at my table and say anything that has a job rating of 2 or above is going to get a bonus. Anything 2 or below, there's going to be no bonus. So I could do this in a slightly different way. So let's delete this out. Another little keyboard shortcut, if you want to select all of the cells in a column, Control, Shift, down arrow. I'm going to delete. So what would this if statement look like? Well, we could do equals if. We could say if the job rating is greater than or equal to 2, I'm going to lock that. If that's true, then they're going to get a bonus. If that's false, then they're not going to get a bonus. And hit enter. So quite simple. Let's double click to copy that down. And there we go. So a bit of an alternative method there. All right. Hopefully you're getting the idea as to how these ifs work. Let's move across now. This is a very, oops, I've still got my data in there from earlier. Excuse me. Little behind the scenes glimpse there. Let's take a look at how we would make this very slightly simpler. So we've seen how we can do nested ifs. We've seen the length of the formula there. Is there a way that we can make this shorter? Well, there is a way that you can make it slightly shorter, and that is by using one of the, I say newer, it's been out for quite a few years now, the if-s function. Not to be confused with ifs, if-s this is. And this is here to make your if statements or your nested ifs slightly shorter when you type them out. I will say it's not that much different, but it is an option. So let's take a look at it. I'm not going to go through all of these like we did last time, but let's just see how this works. So for this one, we're going to use if-s, press the tab key. Logical test number 1. So again, we're going for the job rating. Is the job rating equal to 5? Close the bracket, comma. Value if true. Well, if that is true, they're going to get a bonus of 3,000. Comma. Now, notice here, it goes straight on to logical test 2. This is the difference. I don't have to type in another if statement when I'm using if-s. I can just go straight into the next logical test. So it is very slightly shorter. So if I say the next logical test is the job rating, if the job rating is equal to 4, then we want the result to be 1,500, comma, I can go straight into the next logical test without adding the if. All right, so you would carry on going. It does make it very slightly shorter, but not really a great deal, in my opinion. Let's carry on going through. So I'm just going to do the first 3 there. All right, and we can close off our bracket, Control Enter. Now notice that when I copy down, for all of the ones that I didn't add, which is basically these ones just here, I have an NA error, but I do have my output for all of the others. Now, this is quite helpful because another logical function that I'm going to show you towards the end of this session is how to deal with NA errors in your spreadsheet, because this isn't really an error. I just have chosen not to include the last 2 in my formulas. All right, so we're going to come back to this at the end when we cover error checking. So that is the difference between nested if statements and using if-else, very slightly shorter. Let me show you one more example of if-else. Maybe I have a situation where I want people to be able to enter in a day number, so maybe something like 5, and have it produce what that day is from this list up here. And it might be that I'm ordering my days of the week so that Sunday is number 1, Monday is number 2, Tuesday is number 3, so on and so forth. So I'm going to use if-else to perform this calculation. I'm going to type in if-else, logical test number 1. Well, what is our logical test here? Well, our logical test is going to be if the value in cell A11, now A11 is currently empty, it's not going to be in a moment, but if the value is equal to 1, then I want it to produce the output of Sunday. Okay. Next logical test, if A11 is equal to 2, then the output is going to be Monday, comma. If A11 is equal to 3, then the output is going to be Tuesday, and we would carry on going. So I'm quickly going to do these because we're going to use these later on in an example. So if A11 is equal to 4, then the output is going to be Wednesday. If A11 is equal to 5, then it's going to be Thursday. If it's equal to 6, it's going to be Friday. And finally, if it's equal to 7, it's going to be Saturday. Okay, again, pretty long. Enter. Again, I have an NA because I currently have no value in this cell, but if I type in 4, it should give me the output that I want. If I type in 1, again, I get the correct output. If I type in a number that isn't accounted for, I'm going to get an NA. Now, it might be if you're using this kind of thing in a spreadsheet, and obviously this can apply in lots of different situations, not necessarily days of the week, you might want to make this a little bit more meaningful for your users by saying to them something like, please enter in a number 1 to 7. So they kind of have an idea as to where they've gone wrong. And that's exactly what I'm going to show you at the end when we talk about error checking in cells and how we can add it in. So I'm going to leave this with an NA right there. Let's move on to COUNTIF, SUMIF, and also COUNTIFs, plural, SUMIFs as well. Because we're talking about 4 different functions just here. Now, COUNTIF and SUMIF in their singular form were the original functions in Excel. And then COUNTIFs and SUMIFs, plural, were introduced at a bit of a later date. Now, the only difference between them is that if you're using COUNTIF or SUMIF, you can only have one piece of criteria. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, well, I don't even know what they do, let's start out with a basic example. We're going to start out with SUMIF. Now, basically, this is a logical formula which allows you to specify criteria. And as I said, when I asked people on LinkedIn about what their most useful formulas were, a lot of people came back to me and said COUNTIF and SUMIF. So this is going to be so helpful to you, and it's a really good thing to have in your Excel toolkit. So what are we doing here? Well, I have a little table. I've got some sales team members. I've got the company that they work for. We only have 2 companies in here. I've got their job title, so they're either a sales rep or a sales manager. And we've got the total amount of sales that each of these team members have generated. And then I have a little table over here. And what I want to work out for this first one is the total sales for Microworld. So I basically want it to look through this column for Microworld, and then whenever it finds Microworld, I want it to add the totals together. Okay, so we're doing a sum, but based on a piece of criteria. So if we type in equals sum if, I'm going to press my tab key. Let's review our arguments. So what we have here are 3 arguments: range, criteria, and sum range. Now remember that any argument that you see that has square brackets around the outside, that's an optional argument. You don't necessarily need it in order to perform the calculation. Now in this case, we are going to use all 3 arguments. Now, the way that I like to think about this when I'm doing it is I sort of kind of work backwards a little bit. I like to think to myself, okay, what is my criteria here? Well, the criteria is Microworld. So the range is wherever I'm going to find the word Microworld. That's how I like to think of it. So my range is going to be this, comma. What is my criteria? Well, my criteria is Microworld, comma. Once it's found Microworld in that range, what do I want it to do? What's my sum range? Well, I want it to add together the total sales. So that is my sum range. Close the bracket, hit enter, and I get my result. Now, let's just check this because we have a small data set. It's quite easy for us to check. And this is another little trick that I always like to show people because I think this is so useful. Now, I'm just going to highlight in this table all of the entries for Microworld. So let's hold down Control as we do this. Let's select everything just here, like so. Now, if I look down in my status bar, can you see that I have all those calculations in my status bar? Average count, numerical count, min, max, and sum. So I can see that the sum here that's based on the cells I have highlighted is 44953. And that's exactly what I've got in my sum if calculation. So always have these totals turned on in your status bar because it's so useful when you're trying to check formulas and other things in your spreadsheet. Now, if you're not sure how to turn those on, it's a very simple case of right-clicking in the status bar and then making sure you have ticks next to these items just here. Okay, that's going to show the information for you. So that is how we perform a sum if. Now notice there we only had one piece of criteria, which is why we use sum if. For the next one, we have 2 pieces of criteria. Now I can't use sum if when I have 2 pieces of criteria. So that is where the sum ifs function comes in. Now we're not going to do that right at the moment. We're going to do that in a minute. I want to go through the other singular versions first of all. Let's do a count if this time. So this time I want to count the total number of employees at Computech. Again, I just have one piece of criteria. So this time equals count if, singular. We have 2 arguments, range and criteria. Again, I like to work backwards. What is my criteria? Well, it's Computech. Where am I going to find it? I'm going to find it in the company range, comma, my criteria, Computech. Close the bracket, hit enter, nice and simple. 6 employees at Computech. And of course, we also have an average if formula as well. So let's just finish off the set. Let's do, what am I spelling just here? There we go. I'm going to move down and tab to select. Then range, criteria, and average range. My criteria is Computech, so my range is going to be the company, comma. Criteria is Computech. My average range, well, I want to know what the average sales are. So I'm going to select the sales column. Close the bracket, hit enter, and there we go. Okay, so 3 examples there of how we can use criteria with sum, count, and average. Extremely useful formulas. So now that we've got that, let's take a look at the plural version, because this is where it gets slightly more complicated. And that is when we have multiple pieces of criteria. So if we go back up to our sum calculation, This time I want to work out the total sales for all sales reps at Microworld. So for this, because we have more than one piece of criteria, we need to use the plural version, sum ifs. Now this is structured very slightly differently. The difference here between sum ifs and sum if is that the sum range is the first argument when you're using sum ifs. When you're using sum if, it's the last argument. Now, I actually prefer it this way around. I find it a lot easier. So what is our sum range? Well, our sum range is the total sales. Nice and straightforward. Criteria range number 1. So my first piece of criteria is Microworld. So my first criteria range is the company range. What is criteria 1? It's Microworld, comma. Then we move straight on to the criteria number 2. So my second piece of criteria is sales rep. So my criteria range is the job title range. And within that range, we're looking for sales rep. Okay. Close off the bracket, hit enter, and we get our result. Okay. A little bit more complex, but still fairly straightforward to put together. Let's now add in another piece of criteria. So this time we're looking for the total sales for all sales reps at Microworld with more than 7,000 in sales. So we're going to go for sum ifs again. What is our sum range? Well, we're still working with the total sales. Criteria range 1. Well, our first piece of criteria is Microworld, so we're going to find it in here. Criteria is Microworld. Criteria range number 2, well, that's going to be the job title range. And our criteria is sales rep. Now, criteria 3, what is our criteria 3 range? Well, our criteria 3 range is going to be total sales again, because we're only looking for sales that are greater than 7,000. Now, here you could hard code that in. If you wanted to, you could hard code in 7,000. In general, I always advise against hard coding things into formulas, simply because if you need to update anything, it's a lot easier just to change the cell as opposed to having to go through all the formulas and change whatever it is that you've hard coded in. So let's select H8, close the bracket, hit enter, and we get our result. Really nice and straightforward. Let's quickly finish off the other ones that we have here. So count ifs. Again, this is the plural version. Criteria range 1, well, we have Computech. So criteria range is going to be the company, and our criteria 1 is going to be Computech, and then we're on to criteria range 2. Hopefully you're getting the idea here. It's really nice and straightforward. Okay. Nice and simple. Let's just do, I'm just conscious of time, so I'm just thinking, I think possibly, I'm sure you get the idea now, so I don't think we're going to do the last one here. I will quickly do average if at the bottom here, just so you can see how it works with average. So we have average ifs as well. Have I selected that? No, there we go, that's correct. Again, average range. So I want to work out the average of the total sales. So that's the range. Criteria range number 1. Well, that is the company range. This is the criteria, Computech. Criteria range 2 is the job title range. Criteria is sales rep. Close the bracket, hit enter, and we get our average. Okay. These formulas are, I cannot stress this enough, so useful in so many types of different situations. So if there was one thing that I practice a lot from this webinar, it would be these, because you're going to find that they come up time and time again. All right, hopefully people's brains aren't fried. If you're typing into the chat panel, I can't see anything you're typing. So again, if you do have any questions about anything that we're covering, make a note of them, and then I'm going to leave 5 minutes at the end of the session just to go through some of them. All right, let's move on to our final couple of examples. So I want to move on to talking about error checking using logical functions. Because in Excel, we have two error checking functions, which are part of the logical functions group, that can really help us when we have errors in our cells. For example, this is a copy of our nested ifs that we were doing earlier. And if you remember, in some of these cells, we have NA. Now, that isn't particularly an error. It just means that what I haven't done is I just haven't included the last two job ratings in the formula. So wherever I have a job rating of 1 or 2 in a cell, it's giving me an NA error because it can't find the value to pull back. Now, what about if I want to change this NA to say something a bit more meaningful? Because what you need to remember is in this day and age where we're always sharing spreadsheets with lots of other people and collaborating, if I was to send this spreadsheet to my colleague and she doesn't really know what I'm doing here, she might look at this spreadsheet and think to herself, oh, wow, this is full of errors. Okay, they're not errors, but it looks like this spreadsheet is full of errors. So to make this more, to make this seem like I'm picking the wrong words here. So to make these errors a little bit more explanatory, I'm going to add in some error checking. Now, the two that we're going to focus on, I'm just going to type them into the field so you can see sort of what they look like. There are two main ones that you need to concern yourself with, and that is if NA and if error. Now, these differ. So if NA, you can only really use when you have an NA error in a cell. Now in Excel, there are all different types of errors that you can get in cells. You might have seen name errors before, or value errors, or div errors, or spill errors, or something like that. Now if I had a div error in a cell, and I tried to sort it out using if NA, it's not going to work because if NA will only help us with NA errors. So in this example here, I can use if NA to help me with this. Whereas if error will account for all errors. It doesn't matter what the error is if you use if error. So if error in many ways is a lot more flexible than if NA is. So let's look at an example of both of these. So we're going to start out by using if NA because we have NA errors up here. So if I want to make this a bit more meaningful so it doesn't look like I have errors everywhere, I'm going to, let's edit our formula. I'm going to do this in the formula bar so it's a bit easier to see. So let's click at the top here. So what I need to do, if I want to change this NA error to a piece of text that's more meaningful, what I can do is wrap my entire formula in an if NA function. So I'm going to type if NA at the beginning and open a bracket. And with if NA, we have two arguments. The first argument is value. The second argument is value if NA. So the value for this cell is being generated by our if-s formula. So all we need to do is click at the end and move on to our next function. Now I can tell Excel what I want it to say in the cell if it comes across an NA error. So what I want it to say in here, I just want it to say no bonus. So I'm going to put that in quote marks on the end. Hit enter. So now I can double click to copy this formula down. Now, if you're wondering why I've got little green triangles here, it's because I was playing around with this spreadsheet earlier and I was working on protection. I've unlocked all of these cells. So this error is basically telling me I have unprotected cells. So it's not an error with the formula, it's an error with the protection on the cells. So now I have exactly what I'm looking for. And if I was to send this to somebody else, instead of those NA errors, I now have no bonus instead. Okay. So it makes your error messages more meaningful. Let's take a look at how we might use this in another example. Now, if we go back, if you remember, when we were working on our little day of the week table over here, we also had an NA error. Now, I could fix this using if NA. That would work because it's an NA error. But just so you can see an example of if error, which accounts for all errors, it's basically the same. So we're going to type in if error at the top here, the same arguments underneath. The value is going to be generated by our if-s function. So we need to click at the end and we can specify what we want it to say. So if somebody enters in a day number that isn't between 1 and 7, they're going to get an error. So I want to let them know, I want to say, please enter a value between 1 and 7. So I'm being helpful here. I'm giving them some guidance. I'm not just letting them get an error. Let's give them some guidance so they have some idea as to what they should be doing. So they're like, oh, okay, fine. They can enter in number 6 and they get their result. Okay, so if error and if NA, super useful. One is more flexible than the other, but you'll find that a lot of the time, NA errors tend to come up more than any other errors. So if NA might be the one that sticks in your head to use, but either are going to work. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on a really popular topic in Excel, and that is lookup functions. Now, before we kind of jump into the content for today, I'll just briefly introduce myself because I know that we do always have new people on our webinars. My name's Deborah Ashby. I'm an IT trainer and I basically specialize in the design, delivery and facilitation of Microsoft courses, both online and in the classroom. And today we're going to explore the wonderful world of lookup functions in Excel, just what we need on a sunny Thursday afternoon. It's very sunny in the UK this week. We're all a little bit shocked by that, but it's not normally this sunny at this time of the year. So thank you for giving up the sunshine wherever you are to come and spend an hour learning some Excel. Now, when it comes to lookup functions, it might be that you have maybe a little bit of experience with lookup functions. I think most people are reasonably familiar, if they do know any lookup functions, with VLOOKUP. Maybe you've practiced, maybe you've got some basic skills there. If you haven't and you're coming here completely not knowing anything about lookup functions, that's absolutely fine. As always, I'm going to try and cater to all different skill levels. We're going to start basic and work our way up. So this session is definitely going to be worth your time, as knowing how to use lookup functions is really an essential skill for everyone, regardless of job role. You really need to have this in your Excel toolkit, particularly if you work with Excel every single day. So let's start out by taking a look at what we've got on the agenda today. There are loads and loads of lookup functions. Obviously, we can't cover them all in an hour, so I've tried to cherry pick the highlights, a best of, greatest hits, we'll call it. So let's take a look at what we've got on the agenda. So we're going to start out with a very basic concept. What are lookup functions? Why are they useful? Why do we need to know them? And I'm going to illustrate this point by just showing you a very basic example of a lookup so you kind of know what we're doing with them. We're then going to dive into everybody's favorite VLOOKUP. And there's two different ways that you can do a VLOOKUP. You can do a VLOOKUP using an exact match, or you can do a VLOOKUP with approximate match. So we're going to explore both of those. Sometimes people find VLOOKUPs a little bit difficult, but they're actually really easy if you break them down into different steps. So we're going to go through it so that you understand. We're then going to move on to talking about HLOOKUP. Now, if you're wondering what the difference is between these two, VLOOKUP stands for vertical lookup and HLOOKUP stands for horizontal lookup. So we'll look at an example of that as well. And then once I've taught you all of that, I'm then going to tell you why sometimes using VLOOKUP isn't the best way to go. There are definitely some limitations with VLOOKUP. We're then going to move on to taking a look at how we can do more complex and flexible lookups using two different functions, index and match. And then I'm going to show you how you can do lookups using one of the newer features or functions, I should say, in Excel, and that is XLOOKUP. Now, XLOOKUP is only available if you have Excel for Microsoft 365. You should already have XLOOKUP, and also the latest standalone version of Excel, which is Excel 2021. We're then going to look at a couple of other lookup functions. Another new one, I'm going to show you how unique works, because this is a function that I use all the time, and it is actually considered a lookup function. We're going to throw in a bit of data validation simply because it works quite well with what we're doing. I'm going to show you how you can perform two-way lookups. And then at the end, we're going to go through another lookup function, which is the choose function. So that's what's on the agenda. I hope that's what you were expecting or something similar to that. If not, feel free to log off. That's fine. So let's start out by talking about what are lookup functions. Well, lookup functions essentially allow us to look up information. It allows us to use a lookup value and look that up in a table and then return a value from a different column or row. Now, that is really difficult to try and visualize without seeing an example. So let's take a look at a basic example so that we're all starting off from the same page. So I'm going to come out of my PowerPoint presentation and I'm now going to dive into that file that I put into the chat. So now is the time for you guys to open that up if you haven't already. This is the file that we're going to be using. All right, so let's go to our first very basic example. Now, as I said, I'm going to zoom in a little bit to make that a bit bigger. All right. So what we have here is just a very basic table of information. It's not formatted as a table. It's just what I've typed into these cells. We have a column with employees, a column with departments, and a column with their salaries. And basically, my manager has said to me, I want you to put together a formula where I can type in the employee name and it's going to tell me what their salary is. So I've used a lookup function to do this. And if you take a look up in the formula bar, you can see that I've used a VLOOKUP. So what exactly is going on here? Well, the way that a lookup function works is that we can tell it something to look up. So in this case, I'm telling it to look up the employee name Claire. I want it to look up this employee name in this table, and then I want it to return what we have in the salary column. So it's going to find Claire and return her salary. If I was to change the employee names, let's go for Mike, it's going to update and it's going to return me his salary. So this is the basic premise behind lookup functions. We're taking a value, we're looking it up in a table, and we're returning something else. It's a really powerful function. So that's a very basic example. The thing really to remember here is that the lookup value that you use, in this case, the employee name, has to exist in the table. It has to be, it has to exist in the table to know what to return. Okay, really important point. So with that in mind, let's move on to taking a look at another example of VLOOKUP. And as I said, there are two ways you can do it, exact or approximate match. So we'll look at the most common one first, which is VLOOKUP exact match. So we're going to move on to our next example. Now, what I have on the page here, again, a very small example, I have some part numbers listed. And what I want to do is find out the description for that part number and the unit price for that part number. Now I have this information stored on another worksheet, the parts catalog worksheet. You can see here in column A, I have all of the part numbers. I then have the descriptions and I then have the prices. So effectively what I want to do is I want to perform a lookup. We're going to use the part number as the lookup value because that's the thing that exists in both tables. And I want it to return the description and then the unit price. Now, the way that I like to do this, and this is a little tip, you don't have to do this, but it does make your life a lot easier, is when you have a table like this, and this is going to be our lookup table, what we're looking information up in. Instead of having to go in and select the entire table every time, you might have a very, very long table. I always like to name this as a range to make it a lot easier when I'm putting together my VLOOKUP. If you've never named ranges before, don't worry, it's not particularly difficult. All we're doing here is basically selecting a cell range and giving it a meaningful name, which we can then use in our formulas. So I'm going to name this entire table, I'm going to give it a name. So Control A is going to select all of my data. Just above where it says part catalog, where it currently says B7, we have our name box. So this is a really quick way of just naming this range of data. So I'm going to click in here and I'm going to call this parts underscore catalog. Now, really important, when you're naming ranges, you can't have a space separating your words. You have to either make it all one word or separate with underscores, as I've done here. So now this range of cells, this table effectively, is named parts catalog. It's going to make it a lot easier for me to use in my VLOOKUP. So let's construct our VLOOKUP. Now, before we get going on that, I should mention, if we jump up to the Formulas tab, if you're wondering where VLOOKUP lives in your function library, you're going to find it underneath Lookup and Reference. It's all the way down the bottom just here. So if you're somebody who prefers to use the function arguments dialog box as opposed to typing it directly into the cell, this is where you can do it from. Now, we're not going to do it that way. We're just going to type it straight in. And I think I'll zoom in a little bit as well so you can see this a bit better. All right, so the first thing we want to return here is the description for the part number. Now, if we type in equals VLOOKUP, and we can press the tab key to put that first bracket in, let's take a look at our arguments. The first argument here is the lookup value. So our lookup value is going to be that part number because that's what we're looking up in the table. We then need to provide the table array, so what we're looking up in, so it's going to be that parts catalog table. The third argument is the column index number. Now, what is that? Well, the column index number is basically the column number that we want to return. So if we just come out of here a moment and go back to our parts catalog, what do I want to return? I want to return the description. Now, the way that VLOOKUP looks at this type of data is it numbers columns from left to right. So your part number is column number 1, description is column number 2, and the price is column number 3. So if I want to return the description, that's going to be column number 2. That's what we're going to have for our third argument. So let's do that first of all. Let's go for VLOOKUP. Our lookup value is going to be what we have in cell A5. Now I'm going to copy this formula down so I don't need to lock that value. Let's comma to move on to our next argument. The next argument is our table array. So this is where we need to go in and select our parts catalog. Now you could jump across to the other worksheet and just select the cell range, but if you have a very large data set, that can be a little bit tedious, which is why I like to give it a name, because at this stage, all you then have to do is press the F3 key on your keyboard, and there is your named range. It's so much easier to do it that way. So that is what we're looking up the part number in the parts catalog. We then need to specify what we want to return. So we want to return the description, which we already established is column number 2. And then the final argument on the end here is an optional argument. How do we know it's optional? It's in square brackets. So I don't have to add an argument onto the end here. If I was just to close the bracket and hit enter, by default, VLOOKUP is going to do an exact match, which is what we're doing in this example anyway. But if I do type a comma, I get the option of true, which is an approximate match. We're going to do that in the next example, or a false, an exact match. And what this false argument will basically do is we're saying we want to exactly match that part number in the parts catalog. So let's close off our bracket. If you want to stay in the same cell so that you can copy down, remember you can do Control Enter, and that will leave you in the same cell. So it's returned our description. Double click to copy down. Now notice that one of these parts, we have an NA in here, and I'm going to show you how we can deal with that type of situation in a moment. Let's first move on and just complete our unit price column. Now this is going to be exactly the same. The only difference is the column that we're returning. So instead of returning column 2 this time, we want to return the price, which is column number 3. So same process, VLOOKUP. Our lookup value is the part number, Our table array, well, we named our table, so I can press the F3 key. We can select parts catalog. What column do we want to return? We want to return the price, which is column number 3. And then we want to exactly match the part number, so we need a false argument. Remember, when you have true or false on the end, you can substitute them with 1 for true or 0 for false. So I could put a 0 on the end here, or because false is the default, I don't have to put anything on the end here. Now we're going to put a 0. Let's close the bracket, Control Enter to stay in that same cell, which makes it a lot easier for us to just double click and copy that down. So that is a VLOOKUP in its most basic form. It's not that difficult when you break it down. Now, as I said, you can see that we've got these horrible NA errors occurring in here. Now, why might I be getting those? Well, I'm going to guess that this part number probably doesn't exist in the parts catalog. So I could go through and maybe do something like a find, so Control F. I could look for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and see if I can find it, which I can't. So that is why I'm getting the NA error, because it can't find that part number. Now, one thing with Excel that we always recommend you do is add in some error handling into your formulas, because if I was going to share this with one of my team colleagues and they just see NAs or errors all over the place, they might get a bit worried. They might think, well, have I touched something? Have I changed a formula? You might want to make this a little bit more explanatory so that everybody can understand what's going on here. So I'm going to add some error checking into my VLOOKUP formula. Now notice that the errors that we have here are NA errors. And there is a formula in Excel specifically for dealing with or giving meaning to NA errors. So I'm going to click up in cell B5 where we have our first VLOOKUP. I'm working up in the formula bar now, and I'm just going to wrap this VLOOKUP in an if NA. Now, notice that underneath there are 2 arguments for if NA, value and value if NA. Now, the value of this cell is going to be generated by the VLOOKUP. So I can click at the end, comma. Now I can specify what I want it to say if it doesn't find the lookup value in the table. So I'm going to get it to say part not found. Now remember, when you're dealing with text in your formulas, they must always be enclosed in double quotes. You can close off our if NA, Control Enter. And now if we double click to recopy this down, notice that it says part not found as opposed to NA. So that's a lot easier for users to understand as opposed to just NA errors everywhere. We can do the same over here. So let's click up in the formula bar. We're going to wrap our VLOOKUP in an if NA. Let's go to the end and specify what we want it to say. So I'm going to say price not found in quote marks. Control Enter. And then when we double click, that's now a lot more meaningful. So that is how you can combine a VLOOKUP with a little bit of error handling just to make this more meaningful. Okay, so VLOOKUP, not as scary as it might first seem. Let's move across to taking a look at an example of that true argument on the end. So the last VLOOKUP we did, we had false on the end. That's when we're doing an exact match. We're exactly looking for the part number in the table. But this example, we can't do an exact match. So let's take a look at it. What I have in this first table are basically some salary ranges. And then on the end here, we have the tax rate that's applied for each of these salary ranges. Now, what I'm aiming to do here in this other small table is I want to find out what the tax rate is for these different salaries. Now, if we take the first one here of $55,000, if I look in my table, I don't have $55,000 listed anywhere exactly. 55,000 is kind of going to fall within this range just here. So because I'm not looking for an exact match, I need to have a true argument on the end, or an approximate match on the end, as opposed to an exact match. Okay, so this is where this true argument comes in. So let's take a look at how this works. Pretty much the same. We're going to go for VLOOKUP, open a bracket. Our lookup value, well, this time it's going to be what we have in cell E5. Table array. Now, I didn't give this table a name. So let's take a look at how we would do it if we don't name our tables. All we need to do is select the table where we want to look up the information. Now, one extra thing you need to do here, if you intend on copying this formula down, remember that's going to move your table cell range as well, unless you lock the table in place. So at this stage, we need to press F4 on our keyboard to keep that table locked in place. We then specify the column index number. So what do we want to return? We want to return the tax rate. Now remember, with VLOOKUP, you number columns from left to right. So the tax rate column is column number 3. What are we doing here? Are we doing an exact match? Are we exactly matching 55,000 in the table? No, we're not. So we want to have a true argument on the end here. Close the bracket, Control, Enter, and that's going to give us our tax rate. So let's just do a quick visual check to make sure that is correct. 55,000 is in fact in this range, and there we have 25%. What I should be able to do now, because I locked that, is copy those down, and we can just check. The first one here is 10%, and then we have 90,000, which is in this range, and that is 28%. So that is the difference between approximate match and exact match. It's really just related to that last argument of true or false. Okay. So that is VLOOKUP. Everybody breathe. I will say, as we're going through this, I can't actually see the chat panel. So if you are asking me questions and you think I'm ignoring you, I'm not. It just disappears from my screen when I share mine. So if you have a burning question, if you can just note it down, and then I'll leave some time at the end for any questions that you might have. All right, guys, are we ready to move on to the next thing, which is HLOOKUP? Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, the only real difference between VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP is really how you have your data structured. So VLOOKUP stands for vertical lookup. And I will say that most of the data that you're going to come across is in a vertical format. For example, this parts catalog is in a vertical format. We have our column headings at the top and our data running down. But you might come across data that is in a horizontal format. So let's take a look at that. Now, I've gone for a little bit of a movie theme on this example. We're going to look up some information. So I want to be able to type in a film name, and I want it to return the year, the rating, and the genre. And I have this information stored off on the movie database worksheet. So again, just a reasonably small table. Now, currently, this data is structured vertically. So I'm going to flip this around so it's displayed horizontally, and then I'm going to show you how we can do an HLOOKUP. So this is going to show you a couple of other little techniques in Excel if you've never done this before. If you do quickly need to flip your data the other way around, you can use the transpose formula. It's not a formula. Well, there is a transpose formula, but this I find easier to use underneath paste special. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab this table, Control C to copy it, and I'm going to paste it on the other page down here. So if we jump up to the Home tab, click the lower half of the Paste button, and jump into Paste Special, notice we have a transpose option just here. And when I click on OK, that's going to flip my data the other way round. So notice that we now have the column headings running this way, and all of our data is kind of running across the worksheet. Now, this is a really ugly way to display data. But you'd be surprised. Sometimes you do receive a spreadsheet that kind of looks like this, and you need to be able to handle VLOOKUPs and HLOOKUPs with it. So how do we do a lookup when it's structured this way? Well, the good news is it's pretty much virtually exactly the same as a VLOOKUP. So we're going to type in HLOOKUP. Take a look at the arguments, pretty much exactly the same. We need our lookup value. Well, our lookup value is going to be the film, comma, our table array. Now, our table array is this big, long table here. So again, I would probably give this a name to make it a bit easier. I haven't done that, so I'm just going to select the entire thing. Let's drag it across. Hopefully it's not too long. There we go. Let's go all the way back. Comma, row index number this time. So instead of a column index number, it's asking us for a row index number. So I want to pull back the year. So which row is year in? Again, we start from the top, 1, 2, 3, 4. So year is row number 2. And then we can specify if we're doing a true or a false. So we're doing the exact match of the film name. So we want a false on the end. Close the bracket, hit enter, and it's returning the year of 2016. Okay, let's do it one more time just so we can practice. This time I am going to put this data into, or I'm going to name the range. So let's Control A to select it all. Let's jump up to our name box, and I'm just going to call this movies. And now if we do our HLOOKUP again, our lookup value is our movie. Table array, because we've named it, we can press F3. We can select movies, click on OK. This time we want to return what the movie is rated, which is row number 3. And we want to do an exact match, so you can have a false or a 0 on the end. Close the bracket, hit enter. Okay, so really straightforward, virtually the same as VLOOKUP. So those are your different scenarios when it comes to using VLOOKUP. So now that we've said all that, I'm going to burst your bubble and tell you about the limitations of VLOOKUP, because once you've been using VLOOKUP for a while, you'll come across scenarios where VLOOKUP just doesn't work. So let me show you an example. Let's jump across to the next worksheet. Now, what we have here, again, is a small table of data. We have some categories, we have some applications, and then we have the revenue that these applications have generated and the profit. So maybe these are paid for phone applications, something like that. And what I want to basically do over here is I want to be able to select an application and have it return the category, the profit, and the revenue from the table. So if I was to select, let's just say if I was to type in Doom, I can see that Doom is in the second column of this table. Now, the first thing that I want to return is the category that Doom belongs to. So effectively, I want to return the category of game. I can't do this with a VLOOKUP. Now, the reason why is because of the way VLOOKUP numbers. If you remember, VLOOKUP numbers columns from left to right, 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. What we can't do is go backwards. So I couldn't say use Doom as the lookup value and then go back one column to find the category. It doesn't work like that. If you type in -1, it's just not going to work. So with VLOOKUP, the caveat here is that you always have to have your lookup value to the left of whatever it is you're trying to look up. But that doesn't happen in all scenarios like the one that we're looking at here, because I want to return the category which is behind or before this column. So this is where we have to use something else. And that something else is index and match. Now, index and match are two separate formulas in their own right, two separate functions in their own right. But you so often hear them kind of combined together, because when you do combine them, they can produce really powerful and complex lookups. And it doesn't matter where your lookup value is in the table when you're using index and match together. So once again, this is something which people do tend to struggle with. I know a lot of people who find index and match really hard to understand. So let's walk through this slowly and hopefully all will become clear. Now, before we do that, I'm going to just throw in a little bonus tip because I don't want to have to keep typing in the application into this box. I want to be able to select the application from a drop-down list. So if you've never used data validation drop-down lists before, then you are in for a treat. I use these all the time. So we're going to create a list of all of our applications. For this, we go up to the Data tab. And in the Data Tools group, we have a data validation drop-down. So let's choose data validation. Now on this settings page, I want to create a list, and then I just need to provide the values that I want to be in that list. So I want a list of all of the apps, as simple as that. So now I get a drop down and I can select whichever one I want, and it just means I'm not having to type them in each time. Now that we've done that, let's take a look at index and match. Now, as I said, these are two separate functions. So we're going to look at each one individually so you understand what each one does, and then that will give you an understanding as to why they work so well together. So let's take a look at index first of all. I'm going to type in equals. We're going to go for index. Now, I think it's at this first stage people get confused because there's like two rows of arguments and people are like, oh, which ones do I use? The general rule here is for most things that you do, it's this top row that you're using here. And that's exactly what we're going to be using in this particular formula. So the first argument for our index formula is array. So what is an array? Well, an array is basically a range of cells. And the way that I like to remember this is your first argument, the array, is always the cell range that contains what you're trying to return. So we want to return the category. Where am I going to find the category? Well, I'm going to find the category in this range just here. That is always your array. I used to struggle to remember what that was when I was learning this formula. So I just remember that it's what I'm looking up, basically, the whole range that contains my answer, comma. The next argument is row number. Now, the app that I've got selected is Instagram. So if I look in the table, where is Instagram? It's towards the bottom. So if I count down till we get to Instagram, how many rows is that? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's 9. So the row number is 9. Let's close that off and hit enter. And that's going to tell me that the category for Instagram is social media, which is correct. Now, that's all well and good. I've got a fairly small data set, but what if I had a data set that had thousands and thousands of rows? Do I really want to spend my time counting down in order to find that row number? No, I do not. So we need to find a better way of finding this row number. And that is where the match function comes in. So let's take a look at match on its own. I'm going to type in equals match. Now for the match argument, for the match formula, we have 3 arguments. The last one is optional. The match requires the lookup value. So what are we looking up? Well, we want to find Instagram. So whatever we have in cell H5. Where are we going to find Instagram? Well, we're going to find it in the apps list. Do we want to do an exact match of the word Instagram? Yes, we do. So we have a 0 on the end there. Close the bracket, hit enter. And would you take a look at that? It gives us the row number. So hopefully you kind of see how these work together. This match formula will generate the row number, and we can then feed that into our index formula to produce our lookup. So let's do the whole lot from the beginning. Equals index. We need to specify our array. Remember, it's what we're looking up. In this case, the category. Comma. Row number. Well, we want the match formula to generate our row number, so we go straight into our match. A lookup value. is Instagram, comma. We're looking that up in the apps list, comma, and we want to exactly match the word Instagram. So we have a 0 on the end there. We close off our match and we close off our index. Hit enter and we get the result that we want. So that is how you do a lookup with index and match. Let's do it again because practice makes perfect. This time we're going to look up the profit. So equals index. What's our array? Answers on a postcard. Our array, remember, is what we're looking up. So this time it's going to be the profit, comma. Row number, we go into our match. Our lookup value, again, is H5. We're looking it up in the apps list and we're doing an exact match. Close off match, close off index, hit enter, and we get our result. And because we have this on a data validation drop-down list, if I change it to something else, all of these values update. Okay, so index and match used together is a really powerful way to perform lookups. I find that I use this more than VLOOKUP these days, simply because I know index and match is pretty much going to work no matter what I'm looking up and what data I have in my table, whereas VLOOKUP does have that limitation of the lookup value having to always be to the left of what you're looking up. Okay, so I'll leave it to you to decide which one you want to go with. Now, a very exciting formula that we're going to do next, because this is a reasonably new, I say reasonably new, it's probably been around for about 2 years now. That's new in Excel world, okay? We have another lookup formula called XLOOKUP. And this really takes all of the hard work out of index and match. So now that I've taught you index and match, I'm going to show you a quicker way of doing it that's a lot easier to use. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, XLOOKUP isn't available in all versions of Excel. It is available if you have Microsoft 365, you should have access to XLOOKUP. Also, if you have Excel 2021, which is actually what I'm using here, the standalone version, the non-subscription version, you're going to have it in there as well. If you're not sure if you have it or not, just simply type in to a cell, any cell, equals XLOOKUP, and if you can see the arguments underneath, then you have access to that function. If you can't see anything there, then you're going to need to use index and match until you get an update and you get XLOOKUP. So let's have a look at XLOOKUP. We're going to use XLOOKUP to return the revenue just here. And I'll show you how much easier this is. So equals, oops, not two X's there, XLOOKUP. We have a lot more arguments for XLOOKUP, but notice that 3 of them are all optional. So you don't have to do these last 3. You can do a very basic XLOOKUP just with 3 arguments. So this is so straightforward. XLOOKUP, lookup value. What are we looking up? We're looking up Facebook, comma. Where are we looking that up? Where are we going to find Facebook? Well, we're going to find it in the apps list. What do we want to return? We want to return the revenue. So we just need to select revenue. That is it. Close the bracket, hit enter. So much easier than doing index and match. So much easier to remember. Now, in case you're wondering about those other arguments, let's just double click and go back in. These optional arguments on the end allow you to specify things a bit further. So if, for example, the word Facebook wasn't found in the table, I could specify text to return if it doesn't find the lookup value. So I could just put something in there like not found, comma. I can choose if I want to do an exact match, if I want to exactly match it or find the next smaller item or the next larger item, whatever we want to do. So I can do an exact match. And then the last option here is which way I want to search through my table. So this is something you can't really do with index and match. So with index and match, you can only search from top to bottom. at least with that basic formula. But with XLOOKUP, you can say, I want to search from the top to the bottom, or I want to search from the bottom to the top, which can be useful if you have duplicate values in your table. Also, if you have your data sorted, you have some options there for which way you're searching in your sorted data. And we're going to take a look at an example of this in a moment. Okay, so that is just what those additional options are on the end. We're not going to have those in this example. We're just going to have those basic 3. And I should be able to switch to something different and everything is going to update. Okay, so index and match and XLOOKUP. As I said, I'm a big fan of XLOOKUP, but it isn't available to everybody. So it's good to know how to do this using index and match as well. So let's move on to another example. And this is actually more of a practical example of how you can use some of those additional arguments for XLOOKUP. So what we have here is a little table which shows some employee names, the department they work in, and the last time they were absent from work. And what you'll notice is that the employee names, they repeat. So they're not unique in here. They repeat over and over again. So we have Gareth Osborne there. Do we have another one? Yes, we do. We have a couple of Aisha Jacobs. We have a couple of Tracy Bells. So there isn't just one employee. Sorry, one instance of an employee name. There's multiple. And what I want to find is the last time that this person was absent. Well, that is where we can use that argument in XLOOKUP. So if we go to XLOOKUP, our lookup value is going to be Tracy Bell. Where are we looking up her name? Well, we're looking it up in the employee array. What do we want to return? Well, we want to return the absent date. So that's this array just here. If not found, do I want it to say anything? I could type in some text there. If you don't want to type anything in there, you can just press comma to move on to the next argument. I want to exactly match the name Tracy Bell, so we're going to do an exact match there. But this time, because I'm looking for the last one, I want to go from the bottom of the list up. So I want to search from last to first. So I can have a -1 on the end there. Close the bracket, hit enter, and it's going to give me that last absent date. So that's just an example of those additional XLOOKUP options. Wonderful. Let's move on now to, again, taking a look at how we can do a lookup, or a two-way lookup, I should say. Now, with this, we have 2 lookup values effectively, and this is a scenario you'll come across quite often. What we have here are some months of the year running across the top, and then we have some travel companies in column A. And then in the middle, we have, these are sales figures for these travel companies from January to December. So what I'm aiming to do down here is I want to find the total sales for the company, but we have 2 lookup values because I want it to find April, first of all, and then I want it to find Go Explore. So what I'm looking for it to return is this value just here, the value we have in E4. But we need to do 2 lookups effectively. Now I'm going to show you how to do this using XLOOKUP again. So it's not that hard. We're going to go for, I keep typing 2 X's. I don't know why. XLOOKUP. Lookup value. Well, we have 2 of them. So let's start with the first one. The first lookup value is going to be the month, in this case, April. Where am I going to find that month? Where is my lookup array? Well, my lookup array is here, all the way across. I'm looking it up in these months. Comma. I then go into my next XLOOKUP. And provide my second lookup value. So that's going to be Go Explore. Where am I looking that up? In this list just here. What do I want to return? Well, my answer could be anywhere in here. So I need to make sure I select all of those values. Now I could carry on and add in more options. I'm not going to. I'm just going to close off my first XLOOKUP, close off my second, and hit enter, and it's going to return my result. And if I check that in the table, I can see that yes, that is exactly correct. Now, I don't have these on data validation drop-down list, but if I change this to February, I would expect this to update to 55,882. So just take a look at that formula again. Really straightforward. You're just doing 2x lookups within each other when you have a two-way lookup. Okay. Quite a lot to take in, I know, for Thursday evening. Let's move on to our last example. I should finish right on time today, which makes a nice change. I normally overrun, so this is good. Oh, actually, I think I've forgotten to show you one little thing, which I think is quite important, because this is also one of the newer functions that have been released in Excel. It's a very simple, straightforward function, but I use it so often, I want to show you it if you've never seen it before. It's called the unique function. Now, if we take a look at these employees down here, I've just gone back to this example because it's a good example to use. We have duplicates in here. So these aren't unique values that I have. Now, sometimes you'll want to basically extract from a list where we have duplicates. You just want to see what the unique values are. And a new lookup function is called unique. As I said, I use this all the time. And in its most basic form, if you just want to get a unique list of these names, you just select the range. Close the bracket, hit enter, and instead of all of these duplicates, you just get a unique list. So really nice and straightforward. I wanted to make sure I showed you that simply because I use this so often. Now, a situation where I might use this would be if I wanted to create a data validation drop-down list just here. If I was to use this range as my data validation list, it's going to include all of the duplicates. So normally I would just create a unique list and then create my data validation drop-down based off of this unique value range instead of this over here. Okay, so I wanted to make sure I didn't forget to do that because I use it so often. I want to show you. All right. Let's move on to our final example, and then I'll let you go and enjoy your afternoon and your evening. This final example is about the choose function. And again, this might not be a function that you've used, and I'm going to show you it because, again, this is something that I use fairly frequently. So I wanted to show you it. I know a lot of people think, well, why should I use this when I can use VLOOKUP or something else? They don't really see the use of it. So I'm going to show it to you and then I'll let you decide. And I'm going to show you why it has its advantages over some of the other lookup functions that I've already shown you. Now, the choose function is exactly that. It is a lookup function, and we're going to use it to basically find the department for each of these employees. Now, notice I have employee names in here, and then I have some codes assigned to them. And these codes relate to different departments. So I have another little table over here. We have 1 to 4 and the relevant departments. So I could use a lookup function and say, look up this in this little table and return the department. I could definitely do that. But I could also use the choose function instead. So let me show you how this differs. Now I'm going to widen out this column a little bit. And we're going to type in equals choose. Now choose has just 3 arguments here. And the first argument is the important one. That's the index number. So for me, the index number, this is what we're looking up basically. So this is cell B4, comma. Now I get to specify my values. So this is where it differs from VLOOKUP, because what I'm going to say here is this cell, and I'm going to lock it because we're going to drag this down. So we're going to press F4, comma, this cell, F4, comma, this cell, F4, comma, this cell, F4. Now you might think, what on earth is she doing there? Basically, I'm specifying what I want to look up in the formula. So it's going to look up number one in this case, and that number one refers to these different cells. So number one is going to be cell G4, which is effectively the sales team. When we drag it down, it's then going to look up number 3, which is going to be cell G6, which is marketing. Okay, so we're putting what we're looking up within the formula as opposed to having it in an external table. So if I now hit enter, it's going to return me what I want, and I can copy that down. Another way that people do this is, instead of having these cell references, you could hard code your values into here. So instead of having these, I could put in quote marks, sales, comma, HR, comma, marketing, and then the final one, which is finance. I could have it like that instead, and it's going to give me the same result. Now, the advantage of doing it this way and having the actual values within the formula is that I could now go in and delete this table, and it's not going to affect any of my formulas because I'm not referencing that table. So if you have a scenario where you don't really want to have a big old lookup table, you could use choose instead to make it a lot neater, and it's just going to select from the options that you provide within the formula. Okay, so that is the major difference. Now I'm going to undo just to bring that back, because I want to show you one final little thing. And again, this is something that I use all the time. Now, in the type of job role that I do, when I'm doing things like this, like webinars, the data that I use is not real data. It's not live data. It's just data that I've made up. And I find myself having to create data sets all the time. And it's a very tedious process having to type in employee names and things like that. So over the years, I've developed a way of making this a lot quicker for myself. For example, these employee names I've just grabbed off of a website that generates random names. So you can just type in 50 and it will generate 50 names. I copy and paste them in. So much quicker than having to type. What about if I want to generate some departments randomly for all of these people? Well, I could go through and start typing in, I want this person to be in sales in my fictional data list. I could carry on doing that. But again, if I've got thousands of rows of data, that's going to take a long time. And it might be that you want to do something like this to practice your Excel skills. Like, finding data to use is a real problem, free data, I should say, because most of it you have to pay for, or, you don't want to end up stealing somebody else's data and using that. So being able to generate your own data sets quickly is a really good skill to have when you're learning or when you're trying to practice. So this is how I would generate a list of departments randomly for all of my employees. I would use the choose function, but I would combine it with the rand between function as well. Now, if you've never used rand between, this is probably my most used function. So what it will do is basically generate a list of random numbers between whatever you specify. So I could say, generate me a list of numbers randomly between 1 and 100. Close the bracket, hit enter, and it's going to generate me a number. I could drag it down and I'm going to get random numbers. So what I could do here is I could use rand between to generate numbers between 1 and 4, because we have 4 departments. So it's going to generate randomly 1 to 4. I can drag it down so that it assigns it to all of these employees, and then it will then just assign the department based on the number using the choose function. So let's combine them together. We're going to type in equals choose. I'm then going to go in to rand between. Because I have 4 departments, my bottom number is going to be 1 and my top number is going to be 4. Now I can specify meaning, or I can give meaning to those values. So if it's a number 1, it's going to be sales. I need to press F4 to lock that. If it's a number 2, it's going to be HR. If it's a number 3, it's going to be marketing. And if it's a number 4, it's going to be finance. Close the bracket, hit enter, and now when I double click, it's going to generate me all of those random departments based on this little table. Okay, so just another little trick that you can use. Consider using round between, because that is so useful in many, many different scenarios. Right, that is it, guys. That is pretty much everything I wanted to show you. Hopefully there we've got a good cross section. I'm guessing most people came for things like VLOOKUP, index match, XLOOKUP. Hopefully we've covered those in enough depth that you understand, and hopefully it's become clearer. If you're a bit confused about those functions, hopefully that's made more sense. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on dynamic arrays in Excel. Now, we always have a lot of our lovely regulars on these webinars, but for anybody who is new, who is joining us, my name is Deborah Ashby, and I'm a freelance IT trainer. I basically specialize in the design, delivery, and facilitation of Microsoft training and courses, both online and in the classroom. And as we've said, we're going to be covering something that's kind of exciting because it's new, and anything that's new is always quite exciting. And that is these dynamic array functions that have been released in Excel. Now, I'm saying that they're new. They're not really that new. They were released around the end of 2018. So they aren't super new, but as with all of these things, they tend to take a while to take hold, and it's only been sort of more recently that people have really been exploring exactly what these can do. So that is pretty much what we're going to do in the session today. We're going to go through all of them. There are 8 of them. I'm just going to show you how they work, and you can think for yourself how you might want to utilize those in your daily work. Now, before we get going, and looking at these functions, I will kind of add a caveat to this, because these functions are only available in Excel for Microsoft 365, formerly Office 365. So if you have Office 365 and you use Excel through that, then you should have these. I will say though, if you are thinking to yourself, well, I'm using a slightly older version, I would say that this is probably still going to be useful to you, because we're going to be going through a lot of tips and tricks when it comes to formulas and functions, and they will probably be available in other versions as we move forward. So it's definitely worth you staying on the call, even if you don't have Microsoft 365. So with all that said, let's take our first look at what these 8 functions are. So I've put them up on the screen here, and we've got filter, rand array, sequence, unique, sort, sort by, my favorite, XLOOKUP, and then XMatch. And what we're going to do is I'm just going to go through each of these, and I'm going to show you just a demo of how they work. And as I said, you can think to yourself how you might use them in your daily work. Now, as I said, these are what we call dynamic arrays. And what I want to start out by doing is really just going through what an array function is, or an array formula, not a dynamic array, just a basic array, in case you don't know what that is. Because to understand dynamic arrays, you need to kind of understand what an array function is. So that's where we're going to start. So let's pull up our spreadsheet. And I think Adam dropped this into the chat. I think he did. So if you want to download that file and follow along with me, then please feel free.
I did download it. It's in the chat, everybody. Sorry, I forgot to mention that at the beginning. It is there. Just scroll up a little bit and you can follow along.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's take a look at just a basic array function so you understand the concept behind them. So I have a very, very basic little table here. I just have some fruit. I have the price per item, and then I have quantity sold, let's say. So if I wanted to do some kind of calculation and work out my totals here, what I would probably do is I might add a total column on the end, and then I would do a calculation. So I might do something like equals sum, and then do C4 multiplied by D4. And that's going to give me my total. I would then copy this down. So now I have my totals for each of my line items. Then if I wanted to find out what the overall total was, I would do another sum calculation in here, and then I would add up all of these totals. And then I get to my answer, which is $129. So what I've had to do there is I've basically had to utilize two different functions to get the result I want. And this is the difference with array functions. You can basically perform multiple calculations all in one go. So let's take a look at how I would do this utilizing an array function. Remember, the answer I'm looking for is $129. So what I'm going to do is say equals sum. Now, instead of selecting individual cells to calculate, I'm going to use the array. An array, you can kind of think of it as another term for a range, okay? So what I can do is I can select the entire range just here, and I can then say multiplied by this range just here, and close my bracket. Now, the tricky thing with arrays is that in order to tell Excel that you want it to calculate this as an array formula, you need to press Control-Shift-Enter to get your answer. So what I've done there is I've done multiple calculations all in one go, Control-Shift-Enter, it knows it's an array and it will calculate it accordingly. And you can tell if an array function has been used because if you look up in the formula bar, you can see that my formula has these curly brackets around the outside. So whenever you see that, that is an array calculation. We've used the ranges to perform our calculation as opposed to the individual cells. Okay, so bear that in mind as we go through these dynamic arrays. So dynamic arrays are kind of similar. They work with multiple values at the same time in a formula. But the advantage of them is that you don't have to press Control-Shift-Enter to do them. And also they will dynamically update. So if anything changes, then the arrays will update accordingly. And as I said, we're going to go through all 8 of these new dynamic arrays. So let's start out with filter. Now, what we have here is we have a little table. And again, this is just a very small sample size of data. And we have some exam results for some students. So what I have here are the block that the students are located in, the student name, the exam they took, and then their pass mark. And what I essentially want to do is filter this information. So you can see in the middle here, I've got block East and exam English. I could choose to change these to other pieces of criteria. And what I want is to see my result over here on the right-hand side. Now, this is a filter function. And as probably most of you are aware, we have a filter function which is available on the data ribbon. In the sort and filter group, you may be used to utilizing filters. So if I wanted to sort by this criteria in the middle here, so I wanted to see everybody in the East block taking the English exam, I could, one way I could do it is to apply filters to the top of these column headings. I could then say, okay, I want to filter or just see everybody in the East block. And I could then filter to select just English. And that's going to give me my results. So that is absolutely fine. I can get my results that way. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, why would I want to utilize a function or a formula to do exactly the same thing? Well, the thing is, now that we can essentially do that using a formula, it means that we can incorporate other functions into that formula to get it to do something else. And it also means that we can use that formula anywhere on this worksheet. When we filter using the button on the data ribbon, we have to filter in this place. We can't filter over somewhere else in the spreadsheet, but with a formula, we can. All right. So let's take a look at how the filter function works. I will say is pretty much the same as filtering from that data ribbon. So let's do our first one here. I'm going to type in equals filter. Actually, before I do that, just a little note here. If you're wondering or if you're not sure if you have access to these new dynamic arrays, I would just encourage you to click somewhere in your Excel and just type in equals filter. If you can see it come up underneath and you can see all of the arguments, then that means you have access to those new commands. If you see nothing, then you don't at this stage. So you might just want to do a quick check to see if you have access to these options. All right. Back to what we were doing. So let's type in equals filter. open our bracket and take a look at the arguments we have. So the first argument here is the array. Okay, now my array in this case is going to be where my results are going to be found. So I'm going to filter for the block East and the exam English. So my results are going to be found somewhere in this block of data, B4 to E23, comma. It's now asking me, what do I want to include? So this is where I start to tell Excel the criteria I want to use to filter. And this has to go in brackets. So the first thing I'm looking for here is I want to filter on the block column. So I'm going to select my block array, B4 to B23. I then say equals, I'm looking for the East block in that array. That's my first piece of criteria. I then need to put in a multiplication sign and open my next array because I'm adding in a second piece of criteria. So we're basically going to do the same thing. I'm now looking for the exam English. So what's the array? So it's this one just here. And it's looking for equals whatever is in cell G7. Close the bracket. Okay. I didn't have to have two pieces of criteria in here. If I was just wanted to filter by the block, I wouldn't need to put in this second array. Comma. I then need to tell Excel what to do if it doesn't find anything. So if nothing matches those two pieces of criteria that I've specified, I could say just do nothing by putting two quotes in there, or I could make this a little bit more explanatory by saying something like no records, something like that, and close my bracket. Let's hit enter and see what it produces. And there we go. Now, I don't know if you remember to when we actually filtered using our filter button on the data tab, it was pretty much this exact same result. What would happen then is because these are dynamic, if this information changes, so if this changes to West, you can see it can't find any records for West and English. If I change this to French and hit enter, it still can't find any. Let me pick one that I know it has. There we go. Let's do West and Maths. And there we get some more results. Okay. And that filter command, you can utilize that anywhere on your spreadsheet. All right. So that is the first one. The cool thing is you can incorporate other functions into the formula to make it do different things and perform in different ways. So that is your first dynamic array filter. Let's move on to taking a look at our next one. Now this one is called rand array. Now, I will say this type of thing is something I use all the time because the kind of thing that I do, I'm a trainer, I have to create my own data sources fairly often. So, for example, on this webinar, all of this data that I'm using here, this is stuff that I've created from scratch. And sometimes I have to create very, very large data sets and add in all kinds of numbers. If you can imagine, if I need a data set that has 10,000 rows, and I want that data set to contain some product information and some sales figures, typing in 10,000 numbers is not good. It's very time consuming. And so I always like to have or utilize commands in Excel, which will randomly generate information for me. Now, again, you may not have too much of a use for this, but this can be very, very useful. So the next command, this rand array, will generate random numbers for you, okay, in whatever formation you want. So let me show you an example of what I used to do before rand array came on the scene. And this is another function that you might want to utilize. It's not a dynamic array, but this is basically what I used to do. So if I wanted to fill in if this was going to be a data source for a training session, and maybe I just wanted to fill in some quantities of sales for these apps, instead of going in and typing in numbers in each of these cells, what I tended to do was use a command called rand between, which basically stands for random numbers between, and then you can specify the bottom number and the top number. So maybe I want my random list of numbers to be between 10 and 100. Close my bracket, hit enter. It generates a random number, which I can then copy all the way down. So that is really helpful if you just need to get some data into some cells, okay? So the rand array function, which is the new dynamic function, works in a similar way, but it's a little bit more, you can specify more options for rand array than you can with rand between. Now, one thing I will say, if you want to use either of these, rand between or rand array, one thing you might notice is that if I come over here and type something, can you see as I moved away, these numbers actually changed? Because this formula will update whenever you click away, do something else. So these numbers are constantly changing. Now, I find that quite annoying. So in general, what I would do would be Control Shift down to select everything. I would copy. God, I'm so out of control with my mouse today. Bear with me. A Control C to copy. And then I would just paste the values. See what I mean? Oh my goodness. Paste the values over the top. Okay, so that now they're just numbers in a cell. The formula behind them isn't there, which means they're not going to change when I click away over the screen. You'll find that that happens when you utilize rand array or rand between. So that's just a little trick for you to do there. So with that in mind, let's take a look at how rand array is different to rand between. So if I type in equals rand array and open my bracket, you can see I have quite a few different options. So this is a little bit more complex than rand between. So it might be that I want to generate a random list of numbers, and I can specify how many rows and how many columns I want. So maybe I want a block of numbers that's 5 rows high, comma, 7 columns across, comma. I can then specify the minimum and the maximum value for my random numbers. So again, let's just do 10 is my minimum, 100 is my maximum. And finally, I get to say if I want those numbers to be integers, which are whole numbers essentially, or decimals. So I'm going to say true because I want whole numbers. Hit enter, and you'll see that's exactly what I get. So I have 5 rows, 7 columns of random numbers between 10 and 100. Okay, so really good for generating. Again, what I would do here would be I would copy and paste these as values over the top if I wanted to do anything with these, such as formatting them. Maybe I want to add currency symbols, things like that. As I said, they tend to update and refresh and the numbers change if you don't do that. Okay. Let's do another one just so you can see the other option that you have in here, which is the decimal option. So rand array. This time, let's do 10 rows. We will do 8 columns. I'm going to say my minimum is 100. My maximum is 250. And I'm going to do decimals this time. So we have our false argument on the end. And there we go. Now I have decimals as opposed to those whole numbers. All right, so a couple of different options there. It's absolutely brilliant if you ever need to just get a whole load of random numbers into a spreadsheet. Okay, moving along, we have sequence is the next one. And you can see here, I don't currently have anything on this spreadsheet. But what the sequence function does, and it's along the similar lines, is that it will generate a list of numbers again, but these are sequential numbers. And this array can be one-dimensional or two-dimensional, and you can specify the start value and also the step value. Okay, so let me show you what I mean by that. Let's type in equals, sequence, open our bracket and see what our arguments are. So again, this is very similar. How many rows do we want for our numbers? Well, I'm going to say, let's say 10 rows, comma. I'm going to have 10 columns, comma. I can then specify my starting number. So I'm going to say 1, comma. Now I can choose if I want to, how much I want to step up by. So maybe I want them to go up in steps of 5. So let's put in 5 there and see what we get. There we go. So you can see now I have my random numbers. It starts at 1, but it goes up in 5. All right. So that is the difference between rand array and the sequence command. You can specify exactly what it is that you want and what step you want it to go up in. Hopefully that all makes sense so far. Some of these, they're not particularly complicated, but they are very useful, I find anyway. Let's move along to the sort function. So again, I'm utilizing similar data here. We have our block, our students, our exams, and our marks. Now the sort function, again, this is one of those commands that we're probably all fairly familiar with using in Excel. If we jump up to our data ribbon again, we have our sort button in here, so we can sort ascending, we can sort descending, and we can also do things like custom sorts, where we can sort on multiple fields. So if I was using this method on this particular data set, I could choose to sort by the student and then by the exam, so on and so forth. And again, the sort function that's now available allows us to basically do the same thing, but in a formula as opposed to in a command that's located on a ribbon. So we have that flexibility of being able to combine it with other functions, and also the flexibility of being able to put it in whichever workbook, worksheet we want. So let's take a look at how it works. I'm going to type in equals sort, open bracket. So again, we are utilizing our array. Now I want to sort all of my data, so I'm going to select everything, B4 to E23, comma. I now need to add in my sort index. So this is the column that you want to sort by. So I've basically selected everything in this table. I now need to say, okay, sort this by whichever column I want. And as with most things in Excel, when we're talking about columns, Excel numbers them from left to right. So block is going to be column 1, student column 2, exam 3, mark 4. So in this case, I want to sort my list by the marks. So I'm going to say column 4 is what I want to sort by, comma. I then get to choose if I want to sort in ascending or descending. And you can see there, descending is -1. So I'm going to add in -1, close my bracket, hit enter, and it gives me all of my results sorted by the mark in descending order. Okay, let's just do that one more time so you can see it the other way around. So let's just do sort, open our bracket. We're selecting all of the data. I'm specifying the column that I want to sort by. So let's do something different this time. Let's sort by the student name. So this is going to be column 2, comma, and I'm going to sort in ascending order this time. So I'm going to add 1, close the bracket, hit enter, and there we go. You can see Adam is there at the top of the list. Not because of his mark, I might add, just because his name begins with A. Sorry about that, Adam. All right, so that is how you utilize sort. Now, similarly, sort by is another new dynamic function. And this is kind of similar to the sort function, but it works in a very, very slightly different way. So let's do our example, equals sort by, open bracket. So again, we're selecting our array. So this is going to be everything in this table, comma. Now this is where the difference occurs between sort and sort by. So this time, instead of selecting a number of a column to sort by, I'm selecting the entire array. So for this, I'm going to sort by mark again, but I'm going to select the entire mark array, comma. I then need to specify ascending or descending. So let's do descending, close my bracket, hit enter, and there we go. All right, so slightly different in the way that it works. Hope that makes sense to everybody. As I said, these are very simple examples, but it's good for you to know how to use them, where they are, and how you might incorporate them into your daily work. Let's move across to the next one, which is the unique function. Now, unique is particularly good because, and again, this is something I find myself having to do fairly frequently. If you imagine, if you have quite a large data set, maybe you have company names, and maybe that company name repeats quite a lot throughout your data set. sometimes you just might want to pull out a unique list of the companies. So if I have 10,000 rows of data and I've got 50 different companies in there, that company name is probably going to be repeated quite a lot throughout that data. So what I might want is just to produce a list of the 50 companies contained within that data. So for that type of stuff, the equivalent on the ribbons would be utilizing the advanced filter, where you can pull out unique records. Now, instead of using advanced filter, we now have a much simpler way of doing this. We can utilize a function called unique, which again is one of these new dynamic array functions. So if I wanted to pull out a unique list of all of the exams, for example, so if you look in my little table, you can see that I essentially only have 4 different exams: English, Maths, History, and French. They're just repeated over and over again in this data. So what I might say is unique, select the array, and that is pretty much all you need to do. Close the bracket, hit enter, and it's just going to pull out that unique list. That is actually a lot quicker and easier than trying to do that utilizing the advanced filter. I could do the same again if I type in equals unique, open bracket. This time let's do it on the student names. Oh, actually no, we don't have repeats there. Let's do it on the blocks. Close my bracket, hit enter, and it gives me those blocks. All right, so really, really useful. Now, one thing also with this unique function is that you can utilize it on data that runs horizontally as well. So far in all of these functions, we've simply been dealing with data that runs vertically down the page. But if you have horizontal data that you want to create a unique list from, like this just here, again, a very simple example, but you can see here we have the word apples repeated twice. If I just wanted a unique list of these fruits, I can again utilize unique, open my bracket, and this time my array is the same thing just here. But if I do comma, I can add in an additional argument just here, and the argument I want is true to return unique columns. Close the bracket, hit enter, and now you can see it's just giving me that unique list of values. Okay, so remember that 2 different ways you can use unique depending on whether it's vertical or horizontal data. Good stuff. Let's move on to the next one. Now, this is possibly my favorite out of all of them, and that won't surprise anybody who knows me because this is XLOOKUP, and I love a VLOOKUP. I also love an index match. And if anybody has utilized those functions, you'll know, particularly with index match, I find a lot of people really struggle to get index match right, or they find it quite difficult to remember. XLOOKUP is going to be your best friend. It literally simplifies the whole process of doing an index match. Now, I'm going to show you a few things in this example because out of all of these, I think this is probably the one that people are going to use the most, particularly if you do a lot of VLOOKUPs or index match. So I'm going to spend quite a bit of time focusing on this just so you understand how it all works. Now, we may have some people on the call today who have maybe never done an index match or a VLOOKUP even. So I am going to show you the process of doing an index match, but then I'm going to show you how much easier it is to do an XLOOKUP. So before we get started, let's take a look at the data that we're going to be analyzing. So what I have here is a list of apps. These are apps that you might find on your mobile phone. I've divided them down into different categories. Then we have the app name, the type of app that it is, the revenue, and the profit for each of those apps. And then you'll see over on the right-hand side, I have a little table here where I want to be able to select an app in here and have it pull back what category, what type, the profit, and the revenue for whatever is selected in cell H4. Now, normally for this type of thing, I would do an index match. Now, before we get into this, I'm going to show you another little trick, which is a little data validation trick if you're not aware how to do it. What I want here is I want to have a drop-down list so that I can easily select the app I want to analyze from a list as opposed to having to come in here each time and type it in. So I'm going to delete out Bejeweled from there, and I'm going to set up a data validation drop-down list. So I'm going to jump up to Data, go across to Data Tools, and I'm going to select Data Validation. Now here, this is very simple. If we go to the Settings tab, what I want is I want a list, and then I need to tell Excel what I want contained within that list. What is my source? So for this, I want the apps. So I'm just going to select everything that I want to appear in that drop-down list and click on OK. So now you see I have this little drop-down arrow, and I can go in and I can select whichever app it is that I want to analyze. So that's a lot more efficient as opposed to just having to type that in each time. Now, let's take a look at how we would do this utilizing an index match. So normally, if I wanted to pull back the category for whatever app I have in here, I would do index, open brackets. Now I'm going to explain this quite slowly for those of you that have never utilized index match before. You can see that the first thing that index asks us for is the array. Now I'm looking for the category in this case, so I want to select the category array. So that's this column just here, like so. Comma. It's now asking for row number. Now to generate that row number, we utilize the match function. We want to type in our lookup value. So what is our lookup value? What are we essentially looking up in this table? Well, we're looking up whatever app is listed in cell H4, comma. Where are we looking for this app? Well, we're looking for the app in the apps list. So again, we need to type in our lookup array, which is the apps list. Comma, our final argument, am I doing an exact match or less than or greater than? Well, I want it to exactly match the text that I have in cell H4. So I'm going to say 0 for exact match. Now, because I've got two open brackets or parentheses, I need to close off 2 as well. So I need 2 brackets on the end. Just to recap what we're doing there, I'm doing an index of the category array, and then I'm saying look for whatever's in cell H4 in the app array, and basically tell me what category it's in. Hit enter, and I get my answer. So if we just have a quick look, so where is Lightroom? Here it is. I can see that yes, that is in the category of photography. So my answer is correct. So that's how you would do an index match, and I could go through and I could carry on doing that for the rest of these. But if I double click just to look at that, that is quite a lot to remember. It's a reasonably lengthy formula, and one that I find people get confused with quite a lot. So I want to show you how much easier this is to do utilizing XLOOKUP. So let's do the next one using XLOOKUP. Equals XLOOKUP, open bracket. We want our lookup value. So I'm looking up H4, comma, lookup array. So where am I looking this up? I'm looking it up in the app column. Comma, what do I want it to return? Well, I'm looking for the type, so I just need to select the type array. That is it. Close bracket, hit enter, she says. Bear with me 1 second, what have I done wrong? I think I've deleted that out. Let me just do that again, sorry. Lookup value, H4, comma, lookup array is app, now double checking everything as I do it. Comma, what do I want returned? The type. So we're going to select that array like so. I don't think we have any other arguments. No, we don't. Close the bracket. And there we go. Okay. So if you take a look at the 2 different formulas, so you can see these side by side. If we jump to the formulas ribbon and just do show formulas so you can see these, Look how much difference there is there. It's such a simple formula. We haven't had to combine two different functions, and it's just a lot easier to remember. Like, a lot of the arguments are a lot more self-explanatory, so you can really understand what it is that you're doing, and the entire formula is shorter. So if you're somebody who uses index match a lot, I would start replacing that with XLOOKUP. Now, another way that I could do this to make this even quicker is I could name my ranges. So instead of selecting them all, I can use named ranges. So let's do that. Let's do it one more time so you can see it, but instead I'm going to name these ranges. Now, in this one, I'm going to be using the app and the profit. So let's just name those ranges. So I'm going to click in the app column, Control-Shift-Down to select everything in that column. I'm going to jump up to the formulas ribbon and I'm going to create a new named range, and I'm going to use this option here, create from selection. I'm going to say use the top row as the name for my range, which is going to be app. Click on OK. And I'm going to do the same for profit. So Control-Shift-Down to select the entire array. Up to create from selection, use the top row, so it's going to be called profit, and click on OK. So when you use named ranges, this makes this process a lot easier as well. So let's do XLOOKUP, open bracket. Lookup value is whatever is in H4, comma, lookup array. Now I don't have to go through and select everything. I can just use my named range, which is app. Comma, return array. I can just start to type it in, and Excel should pick that up, like so. Close my bracket, hit enter, and I get my result. So again, if we look at those formulas by clicking on Show Formulas, you can see it's getting shorter each time we're doing it. Okay, hopefully that makes sense, and I hope that is a big one for people who utilize things like VLOOKUP and index match all the time. It is a bit of a game changer, I think. All right, let's move on to the final one. I think we're going to finish a little bit earlier than normal today, guys. Let's take a look at XMatch. Now, again, this is kind of along the similar lines. So XMatch is really the match function, but an updated version of the match function. And I have two little examples to show you here. The first one, I've just taken that data that we've been using to keep things consistent. And what I've got here again is the apps, and I just have the revenue listed out. Now, what XMatch will do, again, it's just very similar to match, but slightly more powerful. You have slightly more arguments which you can add in. So, for example, in this little table just here, I have the app name Candy Crush. And again, if you wanted to, you could create some kind of drop-down list to make this easy to select and change. And all I want to do is I want to find the position that Candy Crush appears in this list. Now, I've purposely done one that's near the top just to make this a bit easier. I can see that Candy Crush is the second app in my list. So the position that I'm looking for here, or the result, is position 2. Okay, that's what I'm aiming for. So let's say equals XMatch. Very simple. Lookup value. My lookup value is F3, comma, lookup array. Well, I'm looking for Candy Crush in the list of apps. And again, you could utilize named ranges for this. But if I do comma, this is where it gets different from the match function. Because what I can do in here is I can specify which way I want Excel to search. Now, for this first example, I'm just going to do an exact match of 0. If I hit enter, it's going to give me that result that Candy Crush is in position 2. Now, what if I have Candy Crush multiple times in this list? So let's just change Google Maps to Candy Crush down here. So maybe I have twice in this list. You can see here it's telling me that Candy Crush is in position 2. Maybe I wanted to find out what position Candy Crush, this one down here, was in this list. So how do I get XMatch to tell me what position this one is in? Well, that is where those additional XMatch arguments come into play. And this is what makes it different from match. You don't have this option when you're utilizing match. So this is kind of like a more advanced version of match. So let's do it again, but this time let's find the position of the second Candy Crush. So I'm going to type in equals xmatch, open brackets, lookup value is F3, comma. I'm looking up Candy Crush in my apps list. So let's do our selection, like so, comma. Now this time, instead of doing an exact match, I'm going to do an exact match or next, sorry, I'm going to do an exact match here, but the next argument, I'm going to say search last to first. Okay, so first to last will go down the list, whereas last to first will go up the list. Okay, so if I do search last to first, which is this one just here, it's going to give me the position of 20 for the second Candy Crush. All right, so it's those additional options that you get on the end which make it different from a regular match command, or match function, I should say. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's move down and see this in a more workable example. So let's go down to this little table here, and we're going to do another X match. Now this X match is different because we're going to do both a horizontal and a vertical match. So you can see here I have a small table which has some sales reps in it, and we then have maybe the sales that each of those sales reps have generated for January, February and March. And what I want to do up here is be able to type in the sales rep name and the month and get their total in here. So essentially we're doing a match, but we're having to match two pieces of criteria, one running horizontally and one that runs vertically. So for this, we can use a combination of index, but we can combine it with an X match. Okay, so let's click in total and let's say equals index first of all. The first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to index basically everything that I'm searching in. So I'm just looking for the totals here. So I only really need to select the totals as my array, comma. I then need the row number. So I'm going to do an X match here, open the bracket, and it's asking me for my lookup value. So the first thing that I'm looking up is I want to look up the sales rep in this sales rep list. So my lookup value is going to be B40. I do a comma. My lookup array, well, where am I looking this up in? I'm looking it up in this array just here. Now I want two pieces of criteria for this, so I'm going to need to close off my bracket, and then I'm going to do a second X match. Because what I also need to specify is the month. Okay, so for this one, my lookup value is going to be the month, C40, comma, and where am I searching for this? Well, this time I'm looking in a horizontal array, C42 to E42. Now, because I've got two open brackets in here, I need to close off both of those, hit enter, and it pulls back my answer. And if I have a look just to confirm that is correct, it all looks good. If I was to change the sales rep, so let's change it to Adam Lacey. Let's see how much work he's done this month. And there we go. If I change the month to January, I get a different result again. Okay, so it's going to dynamically update even if my criteria changes. So that might seem like quite a long formula, but it is a lot shorter than if you were trying to do this using index and match as opposed to index and X match. Okay, so those are the 8 dynamic array functions in Excel. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you all enjoyed that. I hope you all learn at least one thing that you think is going to help you. Have a great night, a great afternoon, a great morning, wherever you are, and I will see you next time. Bye, guys.
If you're not a subscriber, click down below to subscribe so you get notified about similar videos we upload. To get the files the instructor used in this tutorial and follow along, click over there. And click over there to watch more videos on YouTube from Simon Says It.